Hi, this is Jen Rubin, and this is Jen Rubin's Green Room. Welcome to the end of another eventful week. Well, if you had a tough week, things didn't go exactly as you planned, or work stressed you out, you can take comfort because Donald Trump had a really rotten week. I mean, really rotten. Let's recount. To begin with, he has finally seen his case go to the judge and the jury. The judge is going to have to come up with instructions. The counsel for both sides is going to have to give their closing summation, and then the case will go to the jury. Now, he didn't testify. I know you may not be surprised, but some people may, because he talks such a good game. But ultimately, he didn't take the stand because at some level, Donald Trump knows that he cannot possibly survive a cross-examination, that he would wind up perjuring himself, that he would wind up digging his own legal grave, or he would wind up doing both. So he chickened out. And keep your eye, as a result of that, on whether he shows at the debates, because I suspect very strongly he will not. What other bad things happened to Donald Trump this week? Well, his witness, one Robert Costello, essentially blew up in his face. He enraged the judge, he got dressed down, and he actually inadvertently made the case that Michael Cohen, who has his problems, was the victim of a mob-like intimidation effort by Donald Trump. So that didn't go very well for him either. What else happened to Donald Trump? Well, once again, we see that he doesn't really have much of a campaign at all. He made a big show of going to the Bronx. He was going to have this huge rally. A few thousand people showed up, and that was it. He's not campaigning in swing states. He doesn't have organization in those states. And I don't think he's going to, because remember, the lion's share of the money that is pouring into his campaign is going to pay for his lawyers. It's not going to a structure that's going to turn out the vote, that's going to get people to the polls. So that was another positive development for the forces of democracy. I would also stress that President Biden really seems to be beginning to hit his stride. He released an ad this Friday with narration done by Robert De Niro, the actor, essentially entitled Snapped. And it makes the case that he's lost his marbles since he lost the 2020 election. Why is he doing this? Well, it's not only because it's a great ad, and it does underscore that there's absolutely no choice between these two candidates, but he's playing the mind game. And he is also announcing at the same time the road to Atlanta. Atlanta? What's happening in Atlanta? The debate. At the end of June, the debate is scheduled for Atlanta. So what Biden is now doing is taunting Trump. He's trying to get under his skin. He's trying to provoke him. And by making such a big deal about the wind-up to Atlanta, he's also making it that much more embarrassing if and when Donald Trump decides not to show up. So he's playing a fairly effective game there. Now, as far as the Supreme Court goes, this is, and I won't lie to you, nothing but a full-scale meltdown, the destruction of the credibility of the Supreme Court. You had not just one flag at one location that shows that Justice Alito identifies with insurrectionists, but a second flag at a second home. I suppose if he had more homes, he'd have more flags. So first of all, this shows that he was essentially lying the first time around, making up a cock and bull story that this was just in response to a nasty neighbor. Well, does he have a nasty neighbor at the second home as well? And of course, he's not going to throw his wife under the bus a second time. So he's responsible for this. He's identifying with an insurrectionist movement. And the second case, he's identifying very overtly with a right Christian nationalist movement that thinks that the Bible, or their version of the Bible, has to supplant the Constitution. And that's what Alito does every single time he writes an opinion. That's what Dobbs was about. Where does he get the idea that life begins at conception and therefore states can outlaw it, that women have no rights, that the fetal life, or whatever they want to call it, has some sort of claim to the invasion of women's bodies? Where does he get that from? Where does he get these decisions in terms of prayer in school, in terms of funding for schools, it's because he's a white Christian nationalist. He thinks Christianity should be the guiding light for the court and for the country. And that's what he's doing. It is a complete abrogation of his oath. He knows it. He's contemptuous of his judicial obligations, and he's not alone. This is also a problem for the Chief Justice. He allows this to go on. He refused to go up to that Congress to testify and to invite or at least accede to an ethics code. He does not speak out against this kind of behavior. He allows Justice Alito to continue writing majority opinions. In fact, he released a majority opinion on Thursday concerning the evisceration of the Voting Rights Act authored by one Sam Alito. It's his court. It's his responsibility. He is not only the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, he is the head of an entire branch of government. And he cannot and he will not get his own house in order. He has frittered away whatever credibility that the court has, and he will be seen as the man who almost single-handedly presided over the demise of the court. Now, the good news here is that I think we're succeeding in putting the Supreme Court much higher on the list of priorities for this election. The Biden campaign needs to make the case very straightforwardly. This Supreme Court is corrupt. It's been corrupted by the MAGA forces. They have MAGA sycophants on the court. And unless you want to preserve not only the presidency, but the court, you have to vote these people out. And then he should set the groundwork, and Democrats should run on it. Democratic voters should insist upon it, on real court reform. That's not only a mandatory code of ethics, but that's term limits, and yes, that is expansion of the court. When the court is so corrupted, so endemically incapable of upholding its oath because certain members of that court cannot bring themselves to comply with not only judicial ethics, but the law, which requires that justices and all judges recuse themselves when there's a question of impartiality, well, then it's time to expand the court. And that's what Democrats need to do. Now, in the meantime, if you live in Illinois, if you know people who live in Illinois, you should be calling, you should be writing, you should be marching outside the offices of one Dick Durbin. Do it politely, do it civilly, do it legally, but this is an outrage. He is head of the Judiciary Committee of the United States Senate, and he sees no point in having a hearing on any of this. No point? How about to demand that Justice Alito show up or the Chief Justice show up? What about a hearing to confirm the absolute impropriety of these actions? He can call expert witnesses. He can testify. He can hear testimony that this is a complete violation of judicial ethics. And why isn't that ethics reform bill on the floor of the Senate? Because he's been screwing around for over a year. This is shameful. He is not capable of meeting the challenge. We have a threat to democracy, a threat to the rule of law, and he is absolutely incapable of carrying out his obligations. So I would plead with the Majority Leader, Chuck Schumer, and I would plead with the members of that Judiciary Committee. If he can't do it, he needs to get out of the way and have someone who is up to the task of overseeing our judicial system and making sure that there is confidence in the court. Right now, we do not have that. We have the likes of Sam Alito and Justice Thomas, and let's not forget Eileen Cannon, who is busy stashing away and exercising her own catch and kill over one of the criminal indictments against Donald Trump. So this is a crisis moment for the courts, and Democrats have to step up, and voters have to step up. So, meanwhile, in foreign policy, things have gone from terrible to absolutely disastrous in Israel and in the Gaza Strip. The Israelis are continuing to press forward on their Rafah expedition and operation, although they say they have become more focused and they are allowing more innocent civilians to leave the area. So that's a somewhat positive thing, I think. But unsurprisingly, the International Court of Justice has issued an order. It's not effective, but it is symbolic, directing Israel to stop because they are perpetuating a famine, they are perpetuating civilian casualties. And this is what's important. There's not a clear objective that is attainable and that will provide security. That's not Jen Rubin telling you that. That's the head of the IDF. That is the member of the war cabinet, Benny Gantz. These are Israelis who have war experience who are saying this is not working. Israel can go into these areas. They can try to kill a bunch of terrorists. That's a good thing. They can try to uproot their system of tunnels and their armaments. But then when they leave, they simply backfill. So what are they accomplishing? They're not accomplishing the end goal. And that's a problem for Israel, that's a problem for the Middle East, and that's a problem for the United States. And that's why President Biden did withhold one shipment of arms and is trying his best to rejigger, restart the discussions of the hostages. Because this week, you saw in a very visceral, visual way, a horrendous film showing the women hostages, some of whom had been killed, some of whom had been injured, others who had been sexually violated, with their hostage keepers talking to them, talking about impregnating them. It was horrifying. And there are a great many people in Israel, including the hostage families, that think Bibi Netanyahu has essentially given up. He doesn't care about these people. He wants to maintain his power. He's going to keep up this war for as long as he possibly can so he can remain in power. So that is a somewhat very distressing development. I will close with this. I'm a sucker for graduation speeches. I love them. They're inspiring. They're sometimes poetic, the better ones. Sometimes I go back and I listen to ones that were given in the past. Barbara Bush gave a great graduation speech years ago. We had Mr. Rogers give a great graduation speech a few years ago. Well, this year, the best one that I've seen came from Ken Burns. Go online. You can access it. It's only about 20 minutes long. And there's a point in the speech. The whole thing is great in many different ways. But there's a point in the speech in which he says, I'm going to suspend my usual neutrality. Do not fall prey to the delusion of equivalence. There is nothing equal about this equation. And he's speaking, of course, of our election. He says we can continue with this flawed 249-year experiment in democracy, or we can go down a very dark and dangerous road. But what he's telling those students is there is no choice. We have reached an inflection point, an existential moment in our political and civic life, he says. And those students have an obligation to vote and to make sure that we preserve this democratic experiment. And I will say, we're coming right up to the edge. We've essentially lost the Supreme Court. If we lose the presidency, we'll be done for. And the legislative branch is not in great shape either. We have the specter of these congressmen going up to New York in their little red ties and their blue suits and their white shirts, paying homage to a criminal defendant, Donald Trump, and helping to already delegitimize whatever verdict is going to come out, as long as it's adverse to Donald Trump. So we are really at the edge, folks. This is a hands-on-deck moment for democracy. And you have to do everything you can, not only voting, not only contributing, but making sure people around you do those things, and to make sure that you are an active citizen. Ken Burns also recalled the words of Mark Twain, which were the highest honor, the highest position in the United States is the role of citizen. So be a good citizen, work to save the courts, the rule of law, democracy, and do not fall captive to despair and to paralysis, because we have 6 months or so to the election, less than 6 months actually, and our democracy holds in the balance. So you've got a lot of work to do. If you enjoyed this program and you enjoy our other programs, please tell your friends. They can listen and follow at Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or wherever they get their podcasts. Just click right there. See you next time. Bye-bye.